Hi, this is a video about the required reading in Lesson 11. So we're going to go over the paper, which was written by Newsome in 1986, and this is a summary of the effects of food processing on nutritive values. This is a really important required reading in this course because the material in the text is not very deep, so a lot of the things that you'll need to know come from this text. So what we're going over in this lesson isn't necessarily about nutrition, being that how nutrients affect the human body, more how the processing methods affect the major and minor food components that we talked about in lesson 2. So those include things like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, and vitamins and minerals. So many of those things that you see on nutrition facts labels. So yes, we are concerned about nutrition, but not in the way that it affects the human body. So let's just talk briefly about what we mean by the word processing or processed foods. So throughout this course, we've identified multiple methods of preserving foods, such as dehydration, thermal processing, low temperature processing, fermentation, and irradiation. These are also all considered processing techniques. So even though they're preserving food, they're also processing it. It seems to me that many people use the term processed foods to mean something very specific, such as these Cheetos as opposed to an apple. But really, most of our foods we consume are processed in some way, and processing the way we mean it in food science and throughout this course. So something like this apple may have been stored in a controlled atmosphere storage. And so that's a form of processing to maintain its nutritive value over a prolonged period of time. Similarly, these bags of lettuce, which we would consider possibly sort of a raw food when we go to a supermarket, they're still actually processed because they're put in these modified air packaging. It keeps them fresh longer and preserves, therefore, their nutrients. So we're going to look at how processing techniques affect nutrients. So in the grand scheme of things, processing allows for at least preservation of some nutrients over potential loss of all nutrients through spoilage. So when we look at it in the very big picture like that, we're doing a very good thing to feed all the people on this planet by processing our foods. When we evaluate the nutrition in processed food and sort of draw out the benefit to drawback analysis. So processing allows us to have increased food availability all year. It can increase the aesthetic qualities in the variety of food products that are seen. So that apple is no longer just an apple, it's apple juice, it's applesauce, it's dried apple, it's many different things. Processing can actually increase the bioavailability. So this means how able your body is to take up those nutrients. And we'll talk about certain specific examples throughout this video. And lastly, it also can actually increase nutrient content. So we can think of fermentation as a way of increasing things like vitamin B. And many processed foods have nutrients added back into them to account for those lost, and that can also increase the total nutrient content. Drawbacks are throughout processing, you are going to lose some nutrients, and there is a change, of course, from the aesthetics, the texture, taste, all of those sort of components, the looks, as compared to the raw food. And that could be a drawback depending on what you're looking at. But once again, stressing overall, processing maintains, retains nutrients so that they are available for us. If we want to look at the nutrition loss in processed foods, there's 3 different things that we should consider. The first is the processing methods, because each processing method has its own effect on nutrients. We should also look at specific nutrients. So how does that nutrient we're looking at, being carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, how does that respond to that processing technique? And lastly, we want to look at the particular food product. Because we can imagine asking ourselves the question, is that food product even a good source of those nutrients that may be lost under that certain processing technique? So for an example, if we look at milk, so what's the effect of pasteurization and cold storage on vitamin C? Well, it loses quite a bit of vitamin C during these processes. But when we consider milk in our diet, is it actually a significant source of vitamin C? And it's not. So therefore, we don't have to be concerned about the loss of vitamin C in milk during pasteurization or cold storage. Something at a broader scheme that we should also consider is all the different things that contribute to the nutrition of the food that we serve at the table. And these are threefold. It includes both the raw food product, so how it was growing, its genetics, the climate, the soil, the maturity at harvest, the handling, the source of food. So we can imagine the nutrients going into a cow affects the nutrition that makes up the steak as a food product. So this actually has quite a huge role to play, and nutrients can change in value twofold or even more in the same food product, so peas, grown under different conditions. Of course, we can also look at the processing methods. We're going to go into much more detail about this, but some of those considerations are the amount of exposure to water, air, temperature, and many other factors. Lastly, we have to consider the last thing that we do before we put the food on our table, which is the home preparation, our cooking of it. So again, the food products are being exposed to air, water, and heat. And this can actually make the largest impact on the final nutrition of the food that's on your plate. So if we think of that food that we're eating from the beginning, when it was a raw product, how it's being processed through to home preparation, all of these three things impact the final nutrition, and they don't impact it equally. So let's look at a specific example. And this is going to highlight how home processing actually has a huge role to play. So we're going to look at peas being cooked for consumption with your meal. So we're going to look specifically at a vitamin that's super sensitive to heat and various other conditions. We're looking at vitamin C. So this gives us a good indication of how much is being lost along the way. So if we prepare fresh peas, we see a loss of 45% of vitamin C when we prepare it at home to eat. If we start from frozen peas, we see a loss of 40%. Now this isn't that different. We can then look at canned or freeze-dried peas, and we see a loss of 35% of vitamin C. So this just sort of indicates that regardless of the source of the processing source of these food products, it's not a huge difference as compared to the final step that you do at home. And at the end of the video, we're going to look at some tips and tricks at home to try to preserve the most nutrients as possible in your food products. So despite there being many factors that are outside of food processing that affect nutrition, this being the growing and harvesting of food as well as our preparation of food at home, we're going to look more closely at the various processing techniques and their effect on nutrition, even if this doesn't have the biggest impact overall, but this is the area that we're most concerned about in this course. As we go through different examples that are presented in this paper, I want you to keep in mind that it is very difficult to predict the loss of nutrients in specific food products. So we're talking about sort of general trends throughout the rest of this video. The different food processing techniques that we're going to be talking about are thermal, low temperature, dehydration, fermentation, irradiation, which we've all talked about before, but we're also going to talk about milling. Before we get into the details for each of these different processing techniques, I thought it would be appropriate to have a quick refresher on some of the chemical components of food. This involves the major components such as carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, as well as a selection of the minor components being vitamins and minerals. As you may recall, carbohydrates can either appear as sort of a single molecule of sugar, so that would be a monosaccharide, and sometimes those monosaccharides come together to form a disaccharide. So a quality that these have is that they can be either reducing or non-reducing. And reducing just kind of means that they're more active. They can interact with other chemicals. Now, all monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, are reducing. And the disaccharides, lactose and maltose, are also reducing. So the non-reducing sugars that we talked about in this course are disaccharides such as sucrose. Now this is really important because these reducing sugars undergo a non-enzymatic Browning reaction called the Maillard reaction with proteins. Now, it's important to note that this does not require heat like caramelization does, but heat can facilitate this process. So we do often see it in places where there has been heat added during the processing technique. But this process can also happen during storage of food. So if you think of peaches sort of browning over time, if you have them canned at home, that's due to the Maillard reaction. And as we just talked about just briefly, so the other non-enzymatic browning reaction is a caramelization. And so that exclusively happens at high heat, and it can happen with both reducing and non-reducing sugars. So carbohydrates can also be in really, really long, long molecules that are composed of sort of multiple monosaccharides joined together. So these we call polysaccharides. So it's more than one, more than two, it's a polysaccharide. And one of the traits that they have are that they could be digestible or non-digestible. So starch is a digestible polysaccharide, but only when it's heated. So this cool thing called gelatinization happens. So so something like rice is full of starch granules, and this is future energy for the plant. And it starts to swell and swell and swell when we heat it with water. And that means that it becomes digestible to us. Now, this process can end, and it can sort of reverse a bit. So if you think of sort of rice, you've cooked it, and then you've put it in the fridge, and it goes through a process called retrogradation, where it becomes kind of a little bit harder again. And there's a cool, informative YouTube video here that you can link from the PDF to watch about gelatinization and learn more about starch granules. So starch, when cooked, can be digested, and there's other polysaccharides though, like cellulose, hemicellulose, the pectins, and the gums that are not digestible. And that's because us humans lack an enzyme to actually break a connection between all these different monosaccharides that are joined together in a polysaccharide, whereas starch has this configuration here called an alpha linkage that we are able to digest. So those are just a couple of things to note about carbohydrates. Now, fats are sort of the term we refer to them are lipids. So this is composed of phospholipids. You might recall those as being important during emulsions. Sterols, which we didn't talk about at all in this course, and then triglycerides. Triglycerides are in bold here because there's something we talked more about, and they are our biggest consumption of lipids. This is our biggest source of lipids that we eat. And a few things to remember about it, or the fats, are that they can go through sort of rancidity reactions. So this is when the fats go off a bit. So one of the processes is called oxidative rancidity. And so this is when polyunsaturated fats mainly react with oxygen, and these form off flavors and smells through many different complex chemical reactions. So that's, you can imagine these long fatty acids, so they're polyunsaturated fatty acids, and they're reacting with oxygens to form all these sort of different flavors. Now, opposed to that, we have hydrolysis of fat. So this is sort of the fats falling apart. So the glycerol backbone here comes off, and then you're left with these fatty acids. And some of these can undergo further reactions. So there's two hydrolysis of fat reactions. So one called hydrolytic rancidity. So this is generally released during heat and requires water, as is alluded to the hydro part of the word there. And then there's also lipolytic rancidity. So this is generally, this is catalyzed by an enzyme called lipase. And this could be either endogenous, so sort of a natural part of a plant or animal, or we can add microorganisms that have lipases that facilitate these reactions. And we talked about a bit of those during cheese processing. So there's some lipase actions that are pretty important during cheese production. So that's just a bit on fats to remember. And then proteins. So proteins are composed of amino acids, and you might think of amino acids as sort of the essential amino acids that you need to eat. And that's sort of a major reason why we need to eat proteins. But proteins are long, complex molecules of these single amino acids. So for your body to use those amino acids to build new proteins in our cells, you have to break down those amino acids. So that is typically done in a couple of different steps. So one is denaturation, which I don't think that word's come up before in this course. So proteins are these sort of complex 3D structures. And in order for them to start being broken down into their single amino acid subunits, that 3D structure needs to fall apart. So that's that denaturation stage. And then next, there's things called proteases. So these are proteins that are enzymes. So they're catalyzing reactions and they're actually degrading other proteins. So one that's really important for our digestion is called trypsin. So this is in your gastrointestinal tract. It is very important for breaking down proteins so that your body can absorb the amino acids to then create new proteins that your body needs. So plants, you can imagine, actually don't want us to really eat them. So they've developed different inhibitors to try to prevent or stop digestion. They're going about their way, they're producing seeds, they're not too stoked about you destroying their progeny. So a lot of them produce things called trypsin inhibitors. So if trypsin is important for our digestion, they produce an inhibitor which stops that trypsin enzyme from functioning. Another thing to consider with proteins is that they react with carbohydrates, so those reducing sugars, to form throughout the Maillard reactions. Vitamins we haven't talked a huge amount about, so this lesson focuses a little bit more on them. So vitamins are simply chemicals that are required for different processes in our bodies. And they're not made by our bodies, so we must consume them from our food sources. And there's about 13 recognized vitamins, 9 of which are water soluble. The ones in bold are the ones that are referred to in the text. And then there's 4 fat soluble vitamins. So you've got vitamin A, D, E, and K, which are fat soluble. And then you've got the vitamin C, and then all the Bs that are the water soluble vitamins. So it's really important to be able, for you to be able to recognize which vitamins fall into which categories. So are they water soluble or are they fat soluble? Because that's sort of a main division for what happens to them during food processing. So let's look a little bit more specifically at these water soluble vitamins and the fat soluble vitamins. Or there's sort of 4 uses of them throughout food processing. So one thing when we're looking at these, and it'll come up as we go through each of the specific processing methods, but their ability to leach. So this means that they're coming out of the food product into the surrounding water. So naturally, water-soluble vitamins will be dissolved in the water that they're immersed into. So then we have losses or leaching of vitamin C and Bs into the surrounding water. And in particular, ascorbic acid, thiamine, and riboflavin leach much more than niacin or peroxidine. The fat-soluble vitamins do not leach, so this is an important distinction. Another thing to consider is sort of their heat sensitivity. So all the water-soluble vitamins are more sensitive to heat than the fat-soluble vitamins. And that being said, there's sort of a rank. So vitamin C is the most sensitive, in particular to heat, light, oxygen, and a neutral pH altogether. So if you can take away the light, if you can take away the oxygen, if you can reduce the heat, if you can actually have that food product be acidic, you'll have less vitamin C loss. Vitamin B1 or thiamine is the second most likely to be, or is the second most heat sensitive, and then you have the remaining B vitamins and not so much the fats. But where the fats aren't prone to leaching or heat sensitivity, they are prone to oxidation. So vitamin A, D, and E, you do need to be concerned about foods that are high in this and their exposure to oxygen because they can oxidize, which means that they're not available for you, for your body for consumption. And there's a couple of vitamins that also play important roles. They are allowed to be food additives in different food products. So vitamin C can be both used as sort of a bleaching agent as well as an antioxidant. And vitamin E also works as an antioxidant. So that means you can add these vitamins to a food product, and they're going to lower the risk of oxidation of other chemicals because they're sort of busy occupying the oxygen so that the oxygen can't be combined and oxidize other components. So I just wanted to summarize these vitamins before we go and sort of look at the picture altogether before we go into the details and different processing techniques. Because you can consider leaching, heat sensitivity, and oxidation, these sort of characteristics in different processing techniques, because some of them increase your chance of, or the amount of leaching or heat exposure. So lastly, minerals. So minerals are chemical elements. So they're the basic building blocks of all the rest of our chemistry, right? So these are our elements. They're not chemicals, right? And they're not made by organisms. We need to consume them in the foods that we eat. And some main ones are calcium, magnesium, sodium, potassium, iron, zinc, and many more that are really important for all of our sort of cellular body processes. So now let's turn our attention to processing methods. And we're going to start with looking at thermal processing. So this involves blanching, which is exposing food to water or steam for 1 to 3 minutes. Low temperature holding, abbreviated as LTH, and this is about 62.8 degrees centigrade for about 30 minutes. This isn't one that came up in our text. This is sort of newly introduced in this required reading and isn't something that's used too much anymore. Then we've got high temperature short time exposure, HTST, and this is exposing for 72 degrees for 15 seconds and is the type of pasteurization that was referred to in our text. Lastly, we have ultra high temperature, or UHT. So this is quite a substantially higher exposure to temperature, right? So we're at 140 to 150 degrees centigrade, but a much smaller amount of time. So this is 4 to 6 seconds. So if we want to kind of compare what happens to vitamin C or vitamin B12 under these different processing techniques, if we look at milk, a low temperature holding retains 0% of vitamin C and 90% of vitamin B12, whereas this increase in temperature and decrease, it's a huge decrease in time, you retain 90% of vitamin C and 100% of vitamin B12. So some of the key points to take away is that higher temperatures with shorter exposure maintain vitamins. So that's a key point to take away. So that shorter thermal processing time really means that we're retaining nutrients. And we can lower that processing time for all of the same reasons that we talked about in lesson 6. So acidic foods need less exposure to heat, right? Because we don't have certain microorganisms growing in acidic foods. If we look at liquid foods, so they're heated by convection, which is much faster than conduction, so we can again lower the amount of time that foods are exposed to heat and retain more nutrients. And additionally, packaging matters. So if you think of a glass jar and how long it needs to be exposed to heat for the heat to sort of move through the glass jar, as opposed to using something like the aseptic packaging, where you can just load straight into the container, you're not waiting for the container to heat up. So that packaging can make a huge difference to the amount of time that food is exposed to these high temperatures, and therefore maintain nutrients. And as we talked about, exposure to water and leaching is important for water-soluble vitamins. So if you're exposing food to steam, you're going to get less leaching than if you are putting food directly into boiling water for blanching. So a 10-degree, another key takeaway is that a 10-degree difference, so in the text they're talking about Fahrenheit, so about 18 degrees Fahrenheit. If there's a rise in processing temperature, this will create about a 10 times increase in bacterial destruction and only a twofold increase in chemical reactions that can lead to destruction of nutrients or flavors. So you can see it's much better to increase your temperature for a smaller period of time to maintain nutrients. When we discuss the different processing techniques in this video, I'm going to present a table with the different food components that we're concerned about. So vitamins, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and minerals. And we will highlight some of the different things happening in these processing methods on the right-hand side of the table. So during thermal processing, vitamins such as C, B1 are reduced. So these are sensitive vitamins to heat, so they can disappear. Vitamin B3 is often found in a bound form, so actually heating releases it and makes it more available for use. So vitamin B3 can increase, while vitamin C and B1 will decrease with thermal processing. As we talked about in the carbohydrates, when we heat carbohydrates or polysaccharides to starches, we get gelatinization, which actually means that they're digestible. So that increases the carbohydrate nutrition. The Maillard reactions also happen between mono and disaccharides and proteins. And when these reactions happen, it means that those components, those nutrients, are no longer available for your body. So through the Maillard reaction, we actually have a decrease in carbohydrates. When we talked about fats, we talked about oxidative rancidity as well as lipolysis. So oxidative rancidity meaning you're going to lose the fats for your body to consume. And we can get lipolytic sort of action when there's sort of excessive amounts of heat. And this actually can increase the amount of fats available to your body because it starts breaking those fats down so that you get free fatty acids and the glycerol. Proteins, we get a loss of proteins because of their reactions with carbohydrates in the Maillard reaction. Heat actually does a lot of good for our body's absorption of proteins. So firstly, heat destroys anti-digestive factors such as those trypsin inhibitors. It also will attack another inhibitor, but this is an amylase inhibitor. So that actually increases carbohydrate digestion. Heat also destroys a protein enzyme called thiaminase, which destroys thiamine. It also destroys avidin, which is a protein which binds biotin and iron. So when heat destroys these proteins, that increases the amount of vitamins, carbohydrates, and proteins that are available for your body. Lastly, minerals are heat stable, but you can see changes in their bioavailability because due to heat, they can no longer interact with other components that they were interacting with. They can also leach into water, so depending on your thermal processing, such as blanching, that might be a concern. So the dehydration process is varied. It's a sort of an ancient form of food processing. So when people first started laying food out in the sun, we've got tray drying all the way to very modern techniques like freeze drying. So throughout the whole dehydration process, you are exposing food products to air, so oxygen, as well as heat. So the more exposure to these things, the larger the decrease or loss of nutrients. So something like tray drying has a more severe loss of nutrients than something like freeze drying, which has a much less severe, shorter exposure to both oxygen and heat. So key points are that the traditional techniques lose more nutrients than modern processing techniques. Sometimes sulfur dioxide is used to inhibit the oxidation that can happen upon exposure to air. So therefore, it increases the amount of vitamin C, A, but it does mean that you do lose a bit of vitamin B1 because this decreases in the presence of sulfur dioxide. So it's mostly recommended for foods that are not a good source of vitamin B1 to be using sulfur dioxide. When you're freeze drying, you're not exposing food products to oxygen, which makes it a much more nutrient-rich dehydration process. Something else that we hadn't talked about before is that you can sort of combine dehydration with adding solutes. So we can as solutes. So they're going to take up that water. And now that water is no longer free, so it isn't needing to be expelled during the dehydration process. So that'll bring down the amount of time that your foods need to be exposed to oxygen and heat during the dehydration process. So it helps retain vitamins in that way. So when we look at our different food components, vitamin C is the most sensitive to heat and oxygen, so it can be often lost during dehydration. Vitamin A is also sensitive to oxidation, so it can be lost. Carbohydrates and proteins can react during dehydration, particularly during long-term storage. So this can be sort of browning that happens, that you'll sort of notice a browning in sort of older dehydrated or dried fruits. Fats can have oxidative rancidity occur during prolonged storage, so something to take in mind with dried meats. And minerals are very heat stable, so they're not affected very much by dehydration. So you can read more about dehydration and the Maillard reaction in Lesson 8. The freezing process is the most similar to raw food. There being a slight change in vitamins if there's been some pre-processing. So some of that blanching, either by water or steam, can reduce some of those water-soluble vitamins. But in general, freeze processing keeps the nutrients very similar to raw food. And all of those qualities that make a good frozen product, so the quick freezing, the maintenance at a constant temperature, the colder the temperature, this all improves the maintenance of these nutrients in frozen products. So you can read back over Lesson 7 for the low temperature preservation and some of those other qualities that keep frozen foods sort of a very good product and things that you want to increase. Oxidation can occur in freezing over a longer period of time. So that's a bit why some of the best before dates are kept at a year or less with freezing products. So we only have a few changes in nutrients that we want to highlight. So vitamin C, if foods are exposed to oxygen while they are in storage, can be oxidized and disappear. And of course, we've got the heat sensitivity of vitamin C during any pre-treatments. So vitamin A and E can also be oxidized, so we can see a loss in those. And fats we want to be concerned about for oxidative rancidity as well. So in freezing, we're mostly concerned again about that pre-treatment as well as exposure to oxygen. Fermentation is an interesting and complex process, so there's a whole bunch of different metabolic pathways going on within your microorganisms. So they may be consuming different nutrients, but they're also producing them. So you don't see an overall net loss of nutrition. You can even see an increase in vitamin B, but not B12, produced by certain microorganisms. So during cheese production, for example, because we talked a lot about that in Lesson 9, when you separate the curds and whey, you can get a loss of vitamins, water-soluble vitamins, with that whey separation. But they're regained during the aging process of cheese, which is kind of cool. So during fermentation, you can see an increase in vitamin B. As we know, the definition of fermentation is actually a breakdown of carbohydrates. That is how we define it. So we do see a change in carbohydrates, but not net overall. We talked about in Lesson 9 that there can be lipolytic rancidity, but these are actually desired in certain cheese flavors. So those lipases are breaking down the lipids and they're creating all these different flavors that are actually desirable. Similarly, with proteins, you can get proteolytic activity, so the breakdown of proteins, and this makes them more easily absorbed by us, and it also changes the texture of these cheeses. So like the camembert, making it, giving it that really creamy, gooey middle, so breaking down all the proteins in milk. So milling's a new processing technique that is brought up in this lesson, and there's a few things that I want to point out. So when we are milling, let's say a wheat kernel, we've got all these different parts of a wheat kernel, like the endosperm, bran, and germ, and those have different amounts of nutrients in each of those. But generally when we mill, we only keep the endosperm, and this is fairly high in carbs, but low in protein and fiber and iron. So most of our loss during milling, most of our nutrient loss from kernel to processed product is because of this separation. And so pre-World War II, there was actually quite a bit of nutritional deficiencies in the US, and there was regulations brought in to supplement wheat flour with some of the things that were being lost. So thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, iron, calcium, and vitamin D. When we look back at what we previously discussed in terms of thinking about the processing technique, the specific nutrient, and the specific food product, and kind of evaluating those things, at this point in time after World War II, it was sort of looked at and went, okay, processing technique milling, we look at all of these nutrients, thiamine, niacin, riboflavin, iron, we're losing these greatly during the milling process. And guess what? This food product, this wheat flour, is actually a huge component of people's everyday diet. And gives them a lot of their daily values of these vitamins. So therefore, it's really important for us to supplement wheat with these vitamins. So it's sort of a sort of different example compared to the milk example we had earlier. The changes in nutrients during milling involve the loss of vitamin B1, B2, and B3. It destroys the fiber in the bran portion, and the fiber actually binds a lot of different minerals, so this allows zinc and iron to be more available, as well as a whole bunch of other minerals listed here. Irradiation is just slightly touched upon in this reading, and the key points is that it's very similar to thermal processing, and that the lower the dose of irradiation, there's a less amount of nutrient loss. So some of the changes are a loss of vitamin C, a loss of vitamin B1, B3, but vitamin B3 and B6 are not very sensitive. There's not a significant effect on carbohydrates or proteins, but you can see oxidative rancidity of fat, so you want to control and keep things a low temperature and an exclusion of oxygen to prevent this from happening. So that ends our review of the different processing techniques and their effect on nutrients. And next I want to go over some of the strategies that are in place to minimize the nutritional losses in processed food. So there are many different factors at play. So oxygen, light, moisture, and temperature, exposure to all of these things can reduce nutritional value. So when we are smart about our packaging, we can reduce oxygen, light, and moisture, and therefore preserve more nutrients. It's really important to maintain cool temperatures during food storage so that we don't see acceleration of certain nutrient losses or chemical reactions. Because oxidative stress is an issue, or oxidative reactions are an issue, we can add antioxidants such as vitamin C, vitamin E, BHA, and BHT to specifically try to prevent some of the oxidation reactions from happening. There's a few different terms brought up as well, in particular during the discussion about milling. So 3 different terms representing the different ways we can supplement nutrients. So restoration means that during the loss of specific nutrients during processing, we restore the original levels by adding more nutrients to the food product. Fortification, though, allows us to add nutrients that weren't actually originally present. So this can be done often with fortified, ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. Enrichment is sort of a broader term, so it's the addition of nutrients to achieve levels of specified in federal standards of identity. So this is used interchangeably with both restoration and fortification. And enrichment we often see in cornmeal, grits, pasta, rice, breads, fruit juices, and fruit drinks. As mentioned earlier, there's several different tips we have for preparing food at home, because preparing food at home has a much bigger impact than all of the processing techniques we just discussed. So here are a few quick tips. So you want to refrain from excessive trimming and chopping. Now, why is this? Well, when we chop things really, really fine, we've given a much bigger surface area. That surface area allows exposure to oxygen and those oxidative reactions to start occurring. We want to cook in covered pans, so this shortens our cook time, keeping things hotter. It also decreases the total amount of water needed. And once again, we're concerned about water-soluble vitamins. So if we've got a lot of water, we've got a lot of space for those vitamins to keep moving out of the food product into the water. So with that in mind, we also want to cook with a minimum amount of water, and we can always keep that water for using in soups or stocks later on. So those nutrients have gone into that water, keep it, turn it into a soup stock. You also want to cook vegetables only until tender, so not overcooking them so that they've been exposed to high prolonged heat. Remember back when we were talking about thermal processing, we want higher heat for a shorter amount of time. And in line with that, steam cooking, pressure cooking, and stir frying are best over boiling or pan frying. After talking about all of these details, I wanted to end on an overview. So the food that ends up on your plate has gone on a journey. So it started as a raw food product, it has been processed in some way, most likely, and now you've cooked and prepared it at home. Keep in mind that all three of these things contribute to the final nutrition as you see it on your plate, as you consume it. Then specifically, when we're looking at processing methods, there's sort of three things to keep in mind. What is the processing method? How is that a specific nutrient affected by that processing method? And is that food product actually an important source of that specific nutrient? Because if it's not, maybe we don't need to worry about that processing method. If it is, then maybe we need to look at how we're obtaining that food and if it is being fortified or enriched in any kind of way. Additionally, I wanted to think about the different sort of actions and processes that we talked about and how they can increase nutrients or remove nutrients. So we've got our main nutrients in the middle here, so our water-soluble vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins, fats, carbohydrates, proteins, and minerals. So some of the different things that we talked about that can actually increase the amount of nutrients. Hydrolytic rancidity or lipolytic action can actually increase sort of the bioavailability of fats by starting to break them down already. Gelatinization improves the digestibility of carbohydrates, and this happens, of course, when we've added heat and water. Heat also destroys anti-digestive factors, which can increase the amount of proteins and actually carbohydrates in our foods, depending on which anti-digestive factors we're looking at. Proteins can actually be denatured by heat, which again aids the digestion process, and they can undergo proteolytic degradation, which additionally has the same role. Specifically during fermentation, we see this. So things that remove nutrients from our food products are heating, so that will destroy, of course, our water-soluble vitamins. Leaching, so water-soluble vitamins moving out into surrounding water. Oxidation of fats, soluble vitamins as well as fats, reduce the amount of those components in our food products. And then Maillard reactions between proteins and carbohydrates mean that these things are no longer available for our bodies either. That ends the review of the Newsome paper. So I wanted this video to highlight some of the key things to focus on because the paper is pretty dense. Please let me know if you have any questions about any of this material. And I hope this video sort of made it a little bit easier to understand. Thanks.